So let's continue with the second half of that part of the presentation. So what we've done before the break was showing you what is new, what is really available already now in the analytics platform on the server. What we are going to do in the next, let's say, 20-30 minutes is to show you what will be available either in December or then in one of the next releases. But most of it will be available in December, at least as a preview. And then we also have everything that is around big data, Spark execution, etc. The piece that will be open source then as of December also. We have split the agenda. Again, we have Greg continue with some of the guided analytics topics. I'm going to talk about some of the integrations that we have done and that we have worked on. And then we have John again talking about, this is really my highlight, all the stuff that we'll put into the Knime server. But those are all the details. We'll let that, which we'll sort out then. And let's start with Greg.
Okay, so again, guided analytics, I don't need to establish context because I was just talking. Hopefully you didn't forget everything over the coffee break. I'm just going to show some of the new views that should be coming in the next release. Again, as Bernd said, we anticipate this will show up in December, but we're not sure yet. We're pretty confident about all of these things. There's a series of views, JavaScript views that we've added, and I'll just go through examples. One example workflow that shows a few of these, but the rest of them we'll do individually. And let's just go ahead and get started instead of me spending time on words. The first thing I want to show you is the optics nodes. Optics is a very fast and flexible clustering algorithm that's very similar to dbScan for people who know dbScan. What I've built here is a workflow that has a set of data coming in. I'm going to calculate distances on that data, feed that into the optics cluster compute node. This is one of the new nodes. So the cluster computation and the cluster assigner interact together. So this generates the clusters and this shows them to you. The cluster computation isn't particularly interesting. There's just a couple of parameters. There's 2 parameters for it, which is the distance between things for them to be considered neighbors, and then the minimum number of points that something has to have in its neighbor set to be considered a cluster. Once I've done the clustering, I can open up this view. The cluster assigner just shows for each of the points in the data set, they've been assigned to a cluster. The black ones have not been. These are noise, so they did not reach the criteria for it to be considered a cluster. Optics has a threshold by which it assigns things to clusters, and that threshold can be changed, and you can change it directly in the view. So as I move this around, you can see the cluster assignments changing. This by itself isn't particularly helpful, but in terms of seeing the clusters change is interesting, but you can't really learn anything from it. So what I've done is I've created another one of these wrap meta nodes that has the cluster view together with a table that will show me the data points. So again, there's the clustering results, and down at the bottom I have a table that will show me the data points as I select them. So these are the rows that are in table 3, are in cluster 3. Here's cluster 1, etc. The interesting thing here, you can see I have 2 clusters that are quite close to each other. If I move this up just a tiny little bit, these fuse into a single cluster. I'll pull it back down again and we can take a look at what these rows actually are. Cluster 4 is a bunch of rows that are taken from this document 61130. This data set that I'm using is a data set that has a natural clustering, right? I'm not going to take random data and show it to you. There's a natural clustering, and the natural clustering in this is on the document ID. So there's a bunch of things from document 61130 that are in cluster 4. If I look in cluster 3, there's also a bunch of things from document 61130. So it makes sense that they're right next to each other, and I can just move this line up and fuse those with each other. Again, I have a problem with the mouse. We have an interactive clustering plot connected to the table below that allows you to explore the data. Optics does all the computation in advance to generate the points here, and then you can actually figure out what cluster you want by looking at the data. That's the really nice thing about it. All right, so that was one. The other one I wanted to show is the tag cloud, which I have a just a screenshot for because there's no sense going into the node. It's not particularly exciting. You read some data. That was that Twitter data before, and this is just doing a tag cloud based on the Twitter data. You can see here's a tag cloud. Knime already has a tag cloud node. It's one of the standard Knime nodes. The difference here is that this interacts with the rest of the JavaScript stuff, and what you end up with on your web page or in that wrap meta node view is an SVG object, where these things are actually text. So you can actually copy them out and paste them into another document. Also, there will be interactivity between these tags and the other pieces of the workflow as I showed before. That's not there yet, so that's why I'm not yet demoing that. The last one for this is the table editor, or actually there's two other pieces. The first is the table editor. This is a very simple thing. This has been a frequently asked question or a frequently asked feature for Knime for quite a while. Here I have a table. I just loaded some sample data. I've added a blank row at the end, so this constant value column allows me to add a blank row, or sorry, a blank column. The column is called annotation, and it's a string column. Now I have a table editor. When I open this, what it allows me to do is edit the table, shockingly enough. So I can go through and add annotations to this. I can change the individual elements here. And I can also change values. So I have access to all of the data in the table. When I save this, what comes out the other side is a new Knime table that has those edited values in it. So in the JavaScript view or in your web application, you can actually now allow the user to make edits to the table or to add annotations to the table, so if you want to take notes. A concrete application of this, aside from the annotation, is doing something like renaming columns. Because I showed you the census data before that had these really horrible column names. And I've created a table editor where I have on the left-hand side the original column name, which is the horrible name, and on the right-hand side I've actually put a sensible name into it. So when tomorrow I do the workflow around around looking at this data, when I actually show the guided analytics story around the census data, we'll have nice new column names that are humanly readable. So just to be clear, these are things that I can edit, right? So I can change the names. Oops. The other new node that this particular workflow shows up is the Data Explorer that shows you a very quick summary of your data. So let's take a look at that. This is another one of those JavaScript nodes that interacts well in a web portal. You get, for each of the numeric columns, you get the column shows up as a row in this table. There's the column name, again, my nice new column names. You can see I have the maximum and minimum values as well as some statistics. Can expand that and see more statistics, and down at the bottom a histogram of the various values in the table. So it's a quick way to get a sense of everything that's in the table. There's also a summary table or a summary tab for the nominal columns. Let me make this a little bit more visible. Oh, okay, I give up. So for the nominal columns here, you see for each of the columns the number of missing values and the number of unique values that are present in it. So for example, in this particular data set from the census data, there were data from 9 different states. So there's 9 unique state fields and there are no missing values. One of the interesting features that this node provides is the ability to remove columns. So I can go through and say, well, this English ability, there's too many missing values, so I'm going to exclude that. Wow. Try that again. That was a Windows bug, not a Knime bug. The English ability, there's too many missing values, so I can exclude that. The vehicle occupancy, also too many, and the means of transportation to work. And then over here on the statistics, if I look down, I'm not really interested in the total travel time or the educational attainment of the person. I can, by just clicking exclude column, the output table is not going to have those columns in it. So I went in with, you can see 30 columns, and I'm coming out with only 25. This 5 I saw the summary statistics of and didn't like had been removed. So again, table editor makes it really easy to add and to change values. The Data Explorer gives you a quick overview of what's in the table and allows you to remove entire columns from it. Sorry, one last one. I forgot this is not a view. People may know the math formula node. You often need to apply the math formula node to multiple columns. And then if you have 10 columns you want to do that with, you have 10 math formula nodes after each other. Often you have to do that with basically the same formula, and it ends up with a workflow that has this long chain of math formulas and lots of opportunities to shoot yourself in the foot by making mistakes. The math formula solves that problem. So what you can do in this one is enter a formula that applies to the current column. In this case, this data set, the census data set, has income values that need to be scaled based on the year in which that value was collected. So they're all scaled by their income adjustment value. And at the top, you select the columns that this will be applied to. So for each of these income columns, I'm going to scale them by the income adjustment value from the same row, and then that replaces that value in the table. So I've told it to replace the selected columns. So with a single node, I've now been able to apply that constant transformation to a large number of columns. Just saves a lot of work and makes things easier. It also means I don't have to enter the same formula over and over again, right, and risk making the mistakes. And with that, I'm done.
Okay, so I wanted to highlight 2 of the integrations, so some work that we spent on integrating different tools and services, one of which is SQL Server and I should make this full screen. Michael told me to make it full screen, but it's only 2 slides really, because I'm going to show that in a demo. The one is the SQL Server along with our services, so that comes from Revolution and being acquired by Microsoft, so they have that now in the available on Microsoft SQL Server, and we have an integration with them. The motivation behind that is partly, of course, user interest, but also we have a quite good relationship with Microsoft. They had us come over to Redmond. We had talked to different groups and also to that group, and that kind of the idea developed. Going to show that quickly. The other thing that I'm going to show is an integration with different Google services. We have Google Analytics. We have had that for quite some time already. Now we are looking also at being able to access, read, and write Google Sheets. So we'll see that also in a demo. Once I come, let's start with our little R example. That's a node that John already mentioned, Microsoft SQL Server connector. It's the same connector that you also would use if SQL Server runs in Azure. It's what you would expect. So you give the connection information, username, password. If you forget your password, you can also look at here in the annotation. Anyway, so it's just one of these connector nodes, and then you can do the typical pre-processing that you do in the querying in the database. So you select the table, do some filtering, grouping, sorting, whatever. So that's kind of getting the data into the right shape. When you run this part of the workflow, this won't cause any CPU on this laptop, but really in the database, because it all happens on the database. The real cool node that we'll add in the December release is this run R model in Microsoft SQL Server. That will have that SQL statement, or let's say the link to the database table or the SQL statement, and it will also produce, let's say, a view or something that then lives in SQL Server. And the second input is, the first grayish input is a model that we train in R. So here we have, this is again using the census data. So we have a small, let's say, a small subset. We train a model. In this case, this is my R script. This is the same, let's say, the same code that Greg also applied in one of his workflows, except that he was using Knime nodes, so you could easily understand what these different things do, but you can do that in R also. And then eventually it comes up with some Knime model, if you can't read that here, but it learns a decision tree, very similar to what Greg did in his demo. And this model is then persisted here in that gray output, and I feed that into my run model on Microsoft SQL Server. That's also one of these data-aware nodes, so that's now that dialog. It gives me what it does. It takes the table, or let's say the SQL, the view in the database, and applies that model to that database table, but that happens all in SQL Server or in Azure SQL Server. So there's some R scripting in here as well. The important piece is that we are currently finally predicting the input data by applying that model. Usually that all of this can also go, so you can run more R script in here, but usually it's just a prediction step. So you can run this, and that will create you a new table in SQL Server, possibly on larger data that you wouldn't want to run in Knime. Then you cache the number of rows, and then you get your data set.
Are you just passing out the R script into the database?
Yes.
And the database can recognize the R
Yes.
something and then run it again?
Yes.
It will not convert from R to SQL?
No. That's a special offering by Microsoft. It's called Microsoft SQL Server with R services. That's what they provide. This piece runs locally, so if you run this one, this will run locally on your laptop. This piece runs on the server or in the cloud. The other thing I wanted to show is the Google connectivity node. Let me just enter Google in here and make this larger. So these are the old nodes, the connecting to Google Analytics, so Web Analytics. These Google Sheets nodes are the new ones. The idea is it's very similar to Excel, except that it's not Excel, but Google Sheets. You have to start off with something that gives you access to Google, and there you have two options. I'm just misusing that workflow. I'm sorry. I keep doing that anyway. So you have two options. Either you do an interactive connection, and that if I do this here and say I authenticate, there are two different options, but let's just use, it's a detail. What happens is it will pop up this view, or the browser window that you also know. Going to use my account and give all the required privileges. Close this one, and this is now authenticated. It's funny, most of the team, most of my colleagues haven't seen those nodes either, so that's also new to them here. So this is now authenticated, and then I can use, for instance, a spreadsheet writer and write my data set here. It's probably a bit too large, but if I write something like 100 rows, easy, and it will write it there. Okay, there is some. It's not yet released, so bear with me. Let's see if that one works. Oh, I know what the problem is. I should tell it where to write it on. US census sample sheet is sample. I have no idea. Can run it now. Well, keep your fingers crossed. So this is now written, and then I can also read it back in here. This will do select, and then I see all my tables that I have in Google Sheets, including all fall summit details. I'm not going to mess with that, otherwise I run into problems with Heather. I see my sheets here, and then I can run it, and it will read it. So it's what you would expect it to do. If you want to see a demo, just come outside, and that completes that part. I think the rest is all covered by Greg. Let's hand over to John, who's going to talk about the server pieces.
Okay, so I just wanted to recap before I move on to this example, because I think it's important to to understand. So what Bernd just showed actually with the SQL and deploying our scripts into Microsoft SQL database with our services is a really nice way of one really nice way to deploy the results of your analytics so in a way that you can use that. And I had a kind of standard workflow here that I put together where I read some data from a database and I read in a model that I've trained elsewhere and then predict the results from this random forest model and write the results back to my database. So that's kind of one way that you could work. And in this case, we're looking at the census, adult census data, and we're trying to predict whether someone's earning more or less than $50,000. So that's one way that you can do. And if you were at the courses yesterday or you're a kind of a Knime analytics platform user for a while, you'll know how to do that kind of thing. And what I wanted to show here is how you could just, or remind people if you didn't know, or let you know if you're new to it, you can basically add in these quick form nodes here, the JSON input, but also the integer input or double input, string input, and so on. And you can put these quick form nodes onto a workflow. And here I'm doing exactly the same thing. I'm reading in my model and I'm predicting a random forest. So I'm basically now enabling this as a REST-enabled workflow. And when I use this deploy to server button, the workflow is uploaded to the Knime server and automatically exposed as a REST web service. So that's really, really cool because it allows you to start integrating into other platforms in your organization. The thing until now that was kind of tricky to do was to actually start playing with that REST node or that REST workflow and hand that to your IT organization in a way that they understand and they can work with. So let's see how you can do that with the Knime server. So I already have here on my Knime server the workflow that I showed in the previous slide. So that just says to look, and we can take a look. Here there's some parameter that I've described, and it's a JSON object describing one row of my data. So that's kind of the default input parameters for my workflow. And I could just run this, and here we can see then that this is converted into a Knime table row and then predicted. And then I basically run my model and predict. The really cool new thing that we've got now is that we can right-click on that workflow and show the API definition. And that's going to then launch my browser and display this in Swagger UI, which is, if you're handing this to people who are integrating REST services, they'll know exactly this tool. And the great thing there is that I can see the kind of options about browsing the metadata associated with this workflow, or probably most interesting here is executing the workflow. So I can click on this option here to execute the workflow, or to see the options available to me when I execute the workflow. And actually what I want to do is I want to try it out. So I'm going to click that button there. And you'll see, again, this familiar JSON record that I described from my in my workflow as the default parameters. So I could just now scroll down a bit further and choose to execute that. But actually what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say, well, let's change this age record for this person from the default, and I'll just give them a bit more money on their capital gains that they made in that year. And now I'm going to execute this workflow. And this is now running the workflow on the Knime server. And you can see how it gives you the curl command that you could use to make that call in an external tool. Shows you the URL that we made the request at. And it actually shows us the response from that REST call. So here you can see the input parameters that we gave. So the age was 46. We changed that from the default. And we gave this more money in the capital gain. And here we have down here the output values from our workflow, and we see the predicted income now more than 50,000 and the confidence 0.92. And so we have the flexibility to change our REST, our workflow to to change which kind of input parameters we want to give and what output parameters we want to, or output values we want to give back. So that's really great as well, because all I need to do then is I can just send this link to my colleagues in the IT department and say, hey, I want you to give my new predictor workflow and I want you to put it into production and link it into your existing systems, and they'll know exactly what to do with this when they have this information. So that's just really making it easier to take your workflow and get that into production. Okay. So one more kind of fairly simple change that we've made is we've added a couple of new workflows into the web portal that are pre-configured, and they also use the REST API, in this case, to list the scheduled jobs that are scheduled to run on the Knime server. So if you want to get an overview of those, you can start to just use those workflows to get a bit of an idea of what's going on your server, and you can also customize them for your own kind of needs to monitor specific things that are happening on the Knime server. So the next thing that I think is really, really cool on the Knime server that we've been working on is a social workflow repository. And so we've already seen that it's pretty easy to share workflows just by uploading them to the server and letting your colleagues kind of pull them down and reuse them. But what the social workflow repository does is it adds a way to actually rate those workflows and discuss the workflows and see the results from the versions that you've created of the workflows, and actually to view this information on all device types. So again, I want to demo this. And yeah, gonna go. So we have basically then a front page for the social workflow repository that gives some context of what's going on this particular Knime server. I can post, if I'm the admin, I can post news there that tells me what's coming up in my organization, what kind of Knime-related interesting things are there. I can get an overview of the latest workflows that have been updated and added to the server. And you can see also the top rated workflows on the server. And here I'm going to look at this performing a k-means clustering workflow because it's the top rated workflow there. I get all the information that you need about the user. So here this is attributed to me and tells me when that was created, and it's been rated as a 5-star workflow. Let's actually, I can see the image of the workflow, so I can see what's going on as a quick overview. And I can scroll down and also see the comments. So you see there's a couple of versions that were created. I can see the version history and the comments with those. So the first version, someone changed the value of k to 10, and then actually someone else said it thinks it should be 5. And then Bernd says, well, this is a nice workflow, but the distance measure could be optimized. So that's maybe something I'd have to work on. I also get the requirements for that workflow, so which extensions need to be installed and which versions are required to actually use that. And finally, I can also download whichever version of that workflow I want to work with, and then use that in my analytics platform. So that's a tool really to help you as an organization make your workflows, make your colleagues aware of what workflows are available and help them to kind of reuse that, improve the workflows, and comment on the workflows that way. Okay. And the final feature of the Knime server that we've been working on very heavily is the Knime server distributed executors. And the reason we've been working on those really come down to this question here. So, do you need more workflow horsepower? Do you need more compute power on your server to run workflows for more people? So currently you can support that by scaling up. So you can take your existing server and just get a bigger one, launch a bigger one in AWS or Azure, or just buy a bigger one in your data center. But the Knime server distributed executors is going to allow you to scale out. So instead of having just one execution mechanism, you can have, in this case, 4. So you've got them 4 times the processing power for your workflows. So just wanted to sketch this out in a bit more detail. So you have this kind of parallel kind of parallel requests coming in to execute workflows. So here there's this red one, the yellow one, and the blue one, and they're all asking the Knime server to execute a workflow. So beforehand, that's just going to be shared on the Knime server, and you may find that if they're all kind of heavy-duty workflows, that things slow down a little bit. So you could buy a bigger server to fix that problem. But with the distributed executors, we basically have a queuing system that can distribute these off to remote executors. So here, executor 1 runs the first workflow, executor 2 the second workflow, and executor 3 the third workflow. And so that just means that, A, you have faster results back, but also, I don't have the problem where this workflow here might kind of cause troubles for the other workflows. So I can just separate that out and allow you to scale out really easily. So far, there's a first preview available with some limited functionality from the current Knime server implemented. In the December release, we'll be able to put out a nearly feature-complete version of the Knime server. And the interesting addition there is the automatic installation. So we'll provide that as Amazon CloudFormation templates. That means you can kind of just launch that into your AWS installation and get started and start testing, see what you like, and let us know what you kind of think of that. And then the third preview will come next with the web portal functionality, and at release we'll be able to do dynamic executor scaling and a bunch of other stuff in there as well. That's a very quick overview of what we're kind of planning in that area. So if you're interested in that, if that sounds like exactly what you need, then come and speak to us, and I'd be happy to tell you more about how that's going to come along in the future. So, okay, with that, that's the end of what I'd like to talk about the Knime server. And I would like to hand over to Tobias to talk about the big data extension and what's been going on there.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot, John.